Have you ever wondered what truly drives countries, especially the really powerful ones, to act the way they do on the world stage?
you know, beyond the headlines and all the diplomatic talk.
Exactly. What are the underlying, maybe less comfortable forces at play?
It's a fundamental question in international relations, isn't it? And it often pushes back against, well, our more hopeful ideas about how states get along.
And that's exactly the kind of challenge we're tackling today. Welcome. We're doing a deep dive into The Tragedy of Great Power Politics by John J. Mearsheimer. It's a really influential book.
And as you'll see, it takes a pretty stark view, challenging those optimistic assumptions head on.
So our mission for you today is to really unpack Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism.
Yeah, we want to explore its core logic, see how he uses it to interpret, centuries of history, and then look at what it predicts for the future, especially global power dynamics.
I'm trying to show you why, in his view, powerful states feel compelled to maximize their influence and, well, what that means for all of us.
And just so you know, this whole discussion is based entirely on an updated edition of Mearsheimer's work. It's a pretty comprehensive look at great power behavior going way back to 1792.
He writes it to be accessible, trying to avoid too much academic jargon, so hopefully it'll be clear. Ready to jump in.
Let's do it. So, Mearsheimer's theory, it starts from this very stark place. The international system is anarchic.
Anarchic meaning no world government.
Exactly. There's no higher authority above states. No global 911 to call, no overarching power to enforce rules or guarantee anyone's safety.
Okay, so in that kind of an environment, survival becomes everything.
It's the primary goal, absolutely. For any great power, the number one job is maintaining its territory, its borders, and its own way of governing itself, its political autonomy.
You know, it reminds me of that stark quote from Stalin, something like, "We want to build socialism, but first, we have to exist."
Precisely. Survival comes first. And this is crucial. That basic need for survival, Mearsheimer argues, directly fuels a constant drive for more power. Why more power? Specifically, why isn't just enough power sufficient?
Because in anarchy, security is always uncertain, always scarce. You can never be sure you have enough. So, great powers are constantly trying to maximize their slice of the global power pie.
It sounds like a zero-sum game.
He explicitly calls it that, a zero-sum mentality. One state's gain in power is seen as another state's loss. It's inherently competitive.
Now, this is really interesting. He's not saying states are aggressive because they're, inherently evil or led by power-hungry maniacs.
Not necessarily. I mean, that can happen, but the core argument is different. He says the system, the anarchic structure itself, forces states to behave aggressively to maximize their own security.
So survival itself mandates aggression in this view. Wow.
Yeah, and this leads right into what international relations scholars call the security dilemma.
Okay, explain that.
Imagine you build a stronger fence purely for defense. Your neighbor sees the fence, gets nervous, and maybe buys a guard dog. Now you see the dog and think, maybe I need security cameras. Right, so steps taken purely for self-protection are seen as threatening by others.
Exactly, and it just spirals. Each side's attempt to feel more secure makes the other feel less secure, leading to this perpetual cycle of competition, arms races, mistrust.
So this relentless pursuit of power, does it ever stop? Is there an end point?
Mearsheimer argues it only really stops, or at least pauses, when a state achieves regional hegemony, basically dominating its own geographic neighborhood.
Like the United States and the Western Hemisphere?
He points to the U.S. as the only modern example of a regional hegemon. It's achieved that kind of dominance in its area.
But what, just regional? Why not aim for global hegemony, world domination?
Because, Mearsheimer said, global hegemony is practically impossible. The main reason, water.
Water.
Yes. The sheer difficulty, the immense logistical challenge of projecting massive land power across large oceans makes it incredibly hard for any state to conquer and control the entire globe. Water acts as a huge barrier.
Okay, that makes sense. So if power is the goal, how do we even measure it? How do states know who's gaining and who's losing?
Good question. Mearsheimer makes a key distinction here between latent power and military power.
Latent power, like potential.
Exactly. It's the underlying societal resources. Think population size and wealth, usually measured by GNP, gross national product. These are the foundations.
And military power is, well, the actual military.
Right. The Army, Navy, Air Force, the forces you can actually use to fight.
And these two are obviously linked.
Deeply linked.
Yeah.
Take population. Russia has about 147 million people. The U.S. around 281 million. China, well over 1.2 billion. Mearsheimer argues a small population just can't sustain great power status.
Because you need people for the army, for industry.
For everything. And you need wealth to fund it all. That's why states watch both latent and military power in their rivals. Think about the Cold War. The U.S. wasn't just worried about Soviet missiles. They were worried about Soviet economic growth, things like Sputnik.
Because that signaled growing latent power, the potential to build more military power down the road.
Precisely. And today, you see the same dynamic with the U.S. and China. There's immense focus on China's economic boom and its huge population as indicators of future military potential.
Now, within military power, Mearsheimer makes a claim that I think is pretty controversial. He talks about the primacy of land power.
Yes, this is one of his most debated points. He argues that only armies, only land power, can actually win a major war decisively on its own.
Wait, what about navies and air forces? Strategic bombing, blockades? We think of those as incredibly powerful.
He argues they can't win great power wars alone. His reasoning is basically twofold. First, civilian populations are surprisingly resilient. They can absorb incredible punishment like bombing campaigns without necessarily turning on their government or demanding surrender.
And second,
modern industrial economies are also very resilient. They can adapt, rebuild, find workarounds. Naval blockades, for example, might hurt, but they rarely deliver a knockout blow against a major power.
can you give some examples?
Sure. Think about the British blockades against Napoleonic France or Germany before World War I. They caused hardship, definitely, but didn't win the war. Or the German bombing of Britain in World War I and II, or even the massive Allied bombing campaigns against Nazi Germany.
None of those, by themselves, forced a surrender.
Right. Mearsheimer argues they didn't. Even in more recent cases, like NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, he'd say other factors were usually needed for success. It wasn't just the air power alone.
Okay, so what's the counterexample? Where does land power prove decisive?
Well, look at how major European wars were ultimately decided. The Napoleonic Wars, World War I on the Western Front, World War II in Europe, they were fundamentally decided by huge armies clashing on land.
And he points to the Eastern Front in WWII specifically, right?
Absolutely. He emphasizes that the Red Army inflicted something like 3 out of every 4 German military casualties in the entire war. It was the grinding land war in the East that broke the back of the Wehrmacht.
This ties back to the point about water, then. If land power is key, but water hinders it.
Exactly. That's the stopping power of water. Large bodies of water are massive obstacles for armies. Projecting land power across an ocean, especially against a well-defended opponent, is extraordinarily difficult.
Napoleon in the English Channel.
The classic example. He dominated Europe on land, but couldn't cross that relatively small stretch of water to invade Britain. Or look at British attempts to land troops in French-controlled Holland in 1799, total failure.
But what about D-Day? Or other big amphibious invasions?
Mearsheimer acknowledges those, of course, but he classifies them as exceptions, usually possible only under very specific favorable conditions,
Right.
like overwhelming air superiority, which the Allies had on D-Day, or when the target country is already fighting a major war on another front, stretching its resources thin, or when the target is, as he puts it, a fatally crippled power, like Japan was by 1945, hammered by years of war and blockade.
It's a compelling point. You mentioned France earlier. Invaded 7 times by land since 1792.
Correct. 7 times by land armies. But never successfully invaded from the sea during the entire period. It really highlights the difference water makes.
Okay, so we have the theory. Anarchy, survival, power maximization, regional hegemony, the limits of water, the primacy of land power. How does this play out with actual great powers? Let's start with U.S.
Right. Mearsheimer calls the U.S. the poster child for offensive realism, at least in its own hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere.
You knew its expansion in the 19th century?
Absolutely. Think about it. The U.S. starts as this collection of relatively weak states on the Atlantic coast. Over the next century, it relentlessly expands westward.
And that expansion wasn't exactly peaceful diplomacy.
Far from it. It involved, brutal campaigns against Native American populations, pushing them off their land. It involved buying territory when possible, Florida from Spain, the huge Louisiana Purchase from France.
Annexing Texas, fighting a war with Mexico to take California and the Southwest.
Exactly. And even looking beyond that, coveting Canada at various points, wanting islands in the Caribbean like Cuba. It was a clear, sustained drive to dominate the continent, to push out European influence, and ensure no rival could challenge it nearby. That's regional hegemony in action.
But outside its own region, the U.S. strategy looked different, right? This idea of an offshore balancer.
Yes. That's the other side of the coin. Once the U.S. achieved regional hegemony at home, its goals shifted regarding other regions, like Europe and Asia. It aimed to prevent any other country from achieving regional hegemony there.
So it didn't want a dominant power in Europe or Asia that could potentially challenge the U.S. later.
Precisely. So the U.S. tended to keep relatively smaller military forces during peacetime, but would rapidly build them up and intervene when a potential hegemon emerged.
Like entering World War I in 1917 when Germany seemed close to winning.
Yes, or entering World War II effectively in 1940-41 against both Germany and Japan. And then, of course, the whole Cold War strategy of containing the Soviet Union.
So Mearsheimer would argue the U.S. interventions weren't primarily about, say, making the world safe for democracy or abstract ideals.
He'd argue the primary driver was realist calculation, preventing a rival from dominating a key region. The rhetoric might be about ideals, but the underlying logic, according to offensive realism, is about power and security.
Okay, let's look at other powers. What about Germany, say, from unification up to 1945?
Germany, in this period, is seen as a classic example of a state trying to overturn the existing balance of power. From Bismarck's Wars of Unification to Wilhelmine Germany's ambitions before World War I, and then obviously Nazi Germany's bid for European domination.
It was consistently expansionist, trying to gain power relative to its neighbors.
Consistently. Though you mentioned an interesting point earlier, that anomaly in 1905. Germany was strong, Russia was weak after its war with Japan. Offensive realism might predict Germany should have attacked Russia then.
But it didn't. Why not?
Mearsheimer acknowledges things like this happen. Sometimes it's miscalculation, sometimes domestic politics interfere, sometimes leaders just don't follow the pure logic of the system. But he sees these as temporary deviations, not refutations of the underlying pressure.
What about Imperial Japan?
Very similar story in Asia. From the late 19th century until 1945, Japan pursued aggressive expansion wars against China, Russia, eventually the U.S. Its goal was clearly to establish hegemony in East Asia, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Again, driven by the perceived need for resources and security in an anarchic world.
That's the offensive realist interpretation, yes. Seeking dominance to ensure survival and prosperity.
And the Soviet Union, despite the communist ideology.
Mearsheimer argues its foreign policy was fundamentally driven by the same cold logic of realism. Expanding its influence in Eastern Europe after WWII, competing with the U.S. globally, he sees this as standard great power behavior, regardless of the communist justifications.
So its collapse wasn't about rejecting realism, but more about
Economic failure. Its latent power base crumbled, making it unable to sustain the competition. The system's logic didn't change. The Soviet Union just couldn't play the game effectively anymore.
even weaker great powers fit this pattern. Italy, for example.
Yes, even Italy, from its unification in 1861 until 1943. Despite being the weakest of the European great powers, it consistently tried to expand its influence in the Horn of Africa, in the Balkans, making ambitious territorial claims during World War I.
They were not modest in their claims, as one historian put it.
Exactly. Even the weaker players feel the pressure to maximize power when they can.
Okay, so if states are constantly competing, what strategies do they use? You mentioned balancing and buck passing.
Right. Balancing is when states actively form alliances and build up their own power to counter a rising threat. Buck passing is, well, trying to get someone else to do the balancing.
Why would they prefer buck passing?
Because it's cheaper and safer. If you can get another country to bear the costs and risks of confronting an aggressor, you can stay on the sidelines, preserve your strength, maybe even gain power relative to both the aggressor and the state doing the balancing.
Can you give an example of buck passing?
A classic one is how Britain and Russia kind of stood back and allowed Prussia to defeat Austria and France to unify Germany in the 1860s and 70s. They hoped a unified Germany would check both France and Russia.
Didn't quite work out perfectly in the long run.
No, definitely a mixed result. Another huge example is the Soviet Union before World War II. Stalin tried hard to get Britain and France to contain Nazi Germany. When that failed, he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler.
Which was essentially the ultimate buck pass, letting Germany and the Western Allies fight it out while the Soviets stayed out initially.
Exactly. It bought Stalin time and allowed Germany to focus westward. It's a ruthless, but from a purely realist perspective, often rational strategy.
What about other strategies? Bandwagoning. Joining the aggressor.
Mearsheimer argues bandwagoning is mostly a strategy for weak states that feel isolated and have no other choice. Great powers rarely bandwagon because they have the capacity to balance, and joining a potential hegemon is usually seen as too dangerous in the long run.
And appeasement. trying to satisfy an aggressor's demands.
Generally seen as a bad idea in offensive realism. Giving concessions is likely to be interpreted as weakness, making the aggressor more demanding, not less. It just encourages them. Think Munich Agreement.
So the big question then, does trying to grab power, does conquest actually pay off?
The historical record is mixed. Sometimes it clearly did. Bismarck's wars unified Germany and made it the dominant power in Europe for a time. U.S. westward expansion created a continental giant.
But other times,
It leads to disaster. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union is the prime example of overreach that led to destruction. Imperial Japan's expansion led to its utter defeat.
so a smart, great power needs to know when to push and when to hold back.
Exactly. Mearsheimer talks about a sophisticated power maximizer, knowing when to raise and when to fold, like in poker. Calculate the odds, understand the limits of your power, don't bite off more than you can chew.
Okay, let's shift focus now to the future. How does offensive realism view the rise of China?
This is really the core of the updated edition of his book. Applying the theory to China's rise leads to some pretty stark predictions.
If China's economy keeps growing,
Then, the theory predicts, China will attempt to dominate Asia to achieve regional hegemony, just like the U.S. did in the Western Hemisphere. It will try to push rivals, especially the U.S., out of its neighborhood.
and the crucial question, will this rise be peaceful?
Mearsheimer's answer is blunt, no. He sees intense security competition between the U.S. and China as virtually inevitable if China continues its trajectory.
Why so certain?
Because the U.S., as the established hegemon in its own region and a global power, has a deep interest in preventing any other state from dominating a key region like Asia.
So the U.S. will try to contain China.
He argues the U.S. will go to enormous lengths to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon. And crucially, it won't be alone.
Who else gets involved?
Most of China's powerful neighbors, think India, Japan, South Korea, Russia, even Vietnam, have strong incentives to worry about a dominant China. They are likely, he predicts, to join the U.S. in a balancing coalition against China.
Are we seeing signs of this already? China's actions?
Mearsheimer points to China's assertive behavior. Its ongoing territorial disputes, 6 of them, most notably Taiwan, its actions and claims in the South China Sea, building artificial islands, challenging naval passage.
Trying to push the U.S. Navy out of the first island chain, maybe even the second island chain?
Exactly. These are seen as clear indicators of China seeking to revise the status quo and establish its dominance, consistent with offensive realism.
Now, a lot of people have more optimistic views about China's rise. What about economic interdependence? Won't trade prevent conflict?
This is a common argument, but Mearsheimer is very skeptical. He points out that high levels of trade existed between great powers before World War I, for example, and it didn't stop the war.
Because when push comes to shove,
Security trumps prosperity. States will sacrifice economic benefits if they feel their survival or core security interests are threatened. The potential gains from trade just aren't enough to overcome the fundamental fear and mistrust in an anarchic system.
what about the argument that China's culture, maybe its Confucian traditions, make it inherently more peaceful? Confucian pacifism.
He dismisses that too. Historically, he argues China has a long record of being a major power that used its strength, pursued relative power, and sought what he calls hegemonic authority, not just some passive, humane authority. Culture doesn't override the structural pressures of the international system, in his view.
Okay, but the elephant in the room. Nuclear weapons. Surely mad mutual assured destruction changes the calculation.
It definitely does. Nuclear weapons create huge incentives to avoid all-out war between nuclear powers. The potential costs are just astronomical. Mearsheimer fully acknowledges this.
But there's a but, isn't there?
Yes. He argues, quite strikingly, that a major war between the U.S. and China is actually more likely than a major war was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
How can that be with nukes involved?
It comes down to geography and the potential nature of the conflict. Think about Cold War Europe. You have the Central Front in Germany, packed with conventional forces and thousands of nuclear weapons on both sides.
Any big conventional war there had a terrifyingly high chance of escalating to nuclear war almost immediately.
Right. The risk was so direct, so massive, that large-scale conventional war became almost unthinkable. Now look at Asia.
It's different. More maritime, more islands, multiple potential flashpoints.
Exactly. There isn't one single central front. You could have conflicts over Taiwan and the South China Sea, maybe on the Korean Peninsula. Mearsheimer argues the magnitude of any individual war would be nowhere near as great as a full-blown war in Central Europe would have been.
So the thinking is a regional war in Asia, while still dangerous, might seem less likely to immediately trigger global nuclear annihilation.
That's the argument. Because the perceived costs of these specific regional conflicts might seem lower, and the pathway to all-out nuclear escalation less certain, the decision to initiate conventional war becomes more thinkable, sadly.
So paradoxically, the lack of a single hyper-militarized front like in Cold War Europe might make conventional war more likely in Asia, even between nuclear powers.
That's his grim conclusion. He specifically suggests a major conventional land war on the Korean Peninsula involving U.S. and Chinese forces is more likely than a similar clash would have been in Cold War Europe.
Wow. And there's one more factor you mentioned, nationalism.
Yes. Nationalism in China today is incredibly potent. It's fueled from the top down by government messaging, but it's also genuinely popular, a bottom-up force.
Hypernationalism, he calls it.
Right. And this kind of intense nationalism can easily pour fuel on the fire of security competition. It makes compromise harder, raises the stakes of disputes, and generally makes the whole situation nastier and more dangerous.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've gone through Mearsheimer's offensive realism anarchy, the drive for power, the security dilemma, hegemony, land power.
How it interprets history, from U.S. expansion to the world wars, and its predictions for the future, particularly the intense competition likely surrounding China's rise.
The core takeaway seems to be that great powers, because of the international system itself, are almost programmed for offense, constantly seeking more power relative to others just to feel secure. It paints a picture of perpetual competition.
It really does. The tragedy in the title refers to this idea that even states that might prefer peace are forced into conflict by the structure they inhabit.
So thinking about this, what does it mean for you listening to this? If Mearsheimer is right, or even partly right, that great powers are locked in this struggle, does it imply that lasting peace between them is, well, maybe an illusion?
And if that's the case, how does understanding this tragedy, this underlying realist logic, change how you interpret current global events? Does it make you view alliances, arms buildups, trade disputes differently?
It's a challenging thought. Consider how deeply this competitive logic might be embedded in international relations, almost like its DNA, and what that truly means for our hopes for a more cooperative, peaceful world, something to really mull over.